Hey everybody, and welcome back to Sip and Talk. Diving back into these tariffs, it seems like every time you think maybe things are cooling down, another headline pops up.
It's definitely been a roller coaster.
Yeah, so Trump's tariffs on China and some other countries, those big numbers, we're talking up to 104% on some Chinese goods, they're still a really big deal. And this time, we're going to go deeper into all the immediate fallout we're seeing in the markets, how other countries are reacting right now, and what this whole thing could mean for, your wallet down the line. It's still this big Trump's tariff gamble, who blinks first kind of game. And we've got more news, more financial reports, and what people online are saying to try and make sense of it all.
And what's really jumping out now as we looked at these latest developments is the clear escalation, especially with China. They're not shying away from these tariffs at all, which has some pretty big implications we need to unpack.
For sure. And you saw that play out right away in the stock market. Remember those big drops after the first tariff news hit? Yeah, well, things haven't really calmed down since then. The S&P 500 dropped over 9% in just 2 days back at the beginning of April, which was, a big shock. And even as of around April 9th, that uncertainty was still hanging over everything.
Yeah, and those market jitters really show you just how sensitive investors are to any sign of a trade war brewing. It just throws so much risk and unpredictability into the mix, which they usually try to avoid.
Right. And it wasn't just a general feeling of, uneasiness. We saw some crazy swings within single trading days, like take April 8th, for example. You had this initial burst of optimism, maybe some hope that things would get resolved quickly, and the Dow just shot up.
Yeah, there was a lot of talk about a potential 1,400-point gain that day.
Exactly, a 1,400-point gain. But then, boom, the news about China's response comes out, plus more talk about even more U.S. tariffs, and it was like someone flipped a switch. The market just did a complete U-turn, and the Dow ended up losing over 300 points.
Yeah, it was a wild ride that day.
To see that 1,400-point potential gain just evaporate like that, it's pretty mind-blowing.
Totally. That kind of intraday volatility really highlights that back and forth that's happening in the market right now. You've got this hope for de-escalation, battling against this very real fear of a trade war that just drags on and on.
And for anyone who's holding stock in companies that do a lot of business with China, like our friend Micky, who always writes in with his Apple shares, it's been brutal. Apple stock dipped almost 5% with a swing of 9% in just one day.
Oof, that's going to hurt.
Yeah, and Tesla's in the same boat, down big time with a 22% drop in just 4 days. These aren't just little blips on the radar for these big companies.
Companies like Apple and Tesla, they have these incredibly complex global supply chains, and China is a huge part of that. These tariffs just throw a wrench into those systems, leading to higher costs for them, and all that uncertainty directly affects how investors value their stock.
Yeah, when you zoom out and look at the bigger financial picture, it's not pretty. The S&P 500 closed at its lowest point since April of last year. The Dow Jones dropped over 4,500 points in just 4 days.
And the Nasdaq took a hit, too.
Oh, yeah. The Nasdaq was down over 13% in that same period. This isn't just a little market correction. This feels like a major shift in how the market sees things.
It definitely does. Those broad market declines, they signal a widespread concern about the potential economic fallout from these tariffs. It's not just a few sectors being affected. It's a reaction across the whole system.
And, it gets down to what matters for everyone, right? Because these stock market drops, they're not just numbers on a screen. They have real-world implications. Wall Street's now drastically lowering its predictions for U.S. GDP growth in 2025, all the way down to around 1%. And there is even some serious talk about a possible recession.
It's a pretty big reality check.
Yeah, it is. I mean, that revised GDP forecast really shows how much these tariffs are expected to drag down the economy. Less trade, less investment because businesses are getting nervous, and this general feeling of uncertainty, it all adds up.
Exactly. And what makes it even more real for everyone is the potential impact on household purchasing power.
Oh, yeah. I saw those estimates, too. I mean, it's estimated that this could shave something like $2,700 to $3,800 off the average U.S. household's annual purchasing power. That's real money that people could be using for, their everyday expenses.
Absolutely. Tariffs essentially act like a tax on imported goods, and those costs often get passed along to consumers, which means higher prices on all kinds of everyday things. So it's a very real, tangible impact on people's wallets.
Okay, so the U.S. has put these tariffs out there. Now, what about the response, especially from China? Since they seem to be the main focus here, it seems like they're not backing down at all. They've announced their own retaliatory tariffs, a 34% levy on certain U.S. goods. And the messaging coming out of Beijing is well, it's pretty strong.
It definitely is.
We're hearing things from their Ministry of Commerce and Ministry of Foreign Affairs like, we won't bow, we won't be bullied, and we're ready to fight to the end.
But they're drawing a line in the sand.
Yeah, it seems like they see these tariffs as a serious escalation and something that's really unfair. The retaliatory tariffs are a way to hit back directly and forcefully, to put pressure back on the U.S. economy, especially on sectors that rely on exporting to China, like agriculture.
And that's a sector that's already been facing challenges, so these tariffs could really exacerbate those problems.
And then there's this other interesting move from China. They've lowered the official rate at which their currency, the RMB, is valued against the dollar. They set it at 7.2038. Now, some experts are saying this could be a strategic way to devalue their currency.
Yeah, that's a possibility. A weaker RMB makes Chinese goods cheaper for international buyers, even with those added tariffs. It's a way for them to try and stay competitive in the export market despite the higher costs from the U.S. tariffs.
Yeah. And all this back and forth could really put a dent in China's economic growth. There are analyses out there suggesting that if the average tariff on Chinese goods going into the U.S. reaches that 104% mark, their economy could slow down by like 1.5 to 2%. That's a pretty significant hit to their projected growth.
A slowdown of that magnitude in the Chinese economy would have ripple effects globally. China's such a big player in international supply chains and a major consumer market for many countries. Any slowdown there is going to be felt around the world.
For sure. Now, what about our allies? Are they happy about all this?
Well, it doesn't seem like they're throwing any parties. Canada's already put in place their own 25% retaliatory tariffs on cars made in the U.S. that don't meet new rules of origin under the USMCA. That went into effect on April 9th.
So a quick explainer for our listeners who might not be familiar with all the trade lingo.
Yeah, good point.
The USMCA are the new trade rules between the U.S., Mexico, and Canada. They replaced NAFTA. And these rules basically dictate how much of a product needs to be made within those three countries to qualify for lower or no tariffs. So basically, Canada's saying, if your cars don't have enough North American parts in them, you're going to pay more.
It's like a buy local rule, but on an international scale. Canada's doing this to protect their own auto industry. It's a clear signal that they're going to stand up for their own economic interests, even in the face of these U.S. tariffs.
And what about the European Union? What are they up to?
Well, reports are saying that they're getting ready to hit back with their own 25% tariffs on a huge amount of stuff that we export to them, maybe up to 70% of it.
Whoa.
Yeah, that's potentially a massive trade war brewing across the Atlantic.
The EU's proposed tariffs really show that there's this broad international consensus that the U.S.'s trade policies are destabilizing and could lead to a global trade war, which nobody wants.
Then there's Japan. Their Prime Minister, Ishiba Shigeru, called this whole thing a national crisis. And there's talk that their stock market could have its worst week in years. So it sounds like they're feeling the heat big time. But here's the interesting part. It seems like both Japan and South Korea are actively trying to sit down with the U.S. and negotiate their way through this. For countries like Japan and South Korea, their economies rely heavily on international trade. So for them, seeking direct negotiations with the U.S. is the most pragmatic way to try and minimize the damage from these tariffs.
Absolutely. In fact, South Korea's trade minister flew straight to Washington to talk about the tariffs, and they're even considering buying more goods from the U.S., including things like natural gas. And get this, President Trump actually had some positive things to say about those talks, which is a bit of a change in tone.
That's interesting. It suggests that the U.S. might be trying to isolate China a bit by showing more willingness to negotiate with other key trading partners. It could be a way to apply more targeted pressure.
Yeah, and here's a number that really jumped out at me. Apparently, over 70 countries have reached out to the U.S. to try and start some kind of negotiation. 70. That's a lot of world leaders feeling pretty anxious about all of this.
That's a huge number. It really underscores the global concern about the potential disruptions to international trade because of these tariffs. It's clear that this isn't just a U.S.-China issue. It has ramifications far beyond those two countries.
And we even had the investor Bill Ackman weighing in with a pretty serious warning. He called this a potential global economic war. And he's concerned that it'll scare businesses away from investing and make consumers tighten their belts. He's urging everyone to take a 90-day pause and just talk it out.
I can see where he's coming from. Ackman's view reflects the fears in the financial world that these tariffs could trigger a broader economic slowdown. The uncertainty alone can be enough to discourage business investment and make consumers hold back on spending.
And this all keeps circling back to that central question, right? Trump's tariff gamble, who blinks first in the chicken game. It really captures the high-stakes nature of this situation, where neither side seems willing to back down.
That chicken game analogy is so apt. It really highlights the very real risk that if neither side compromises and de-escalates the situation, they could both end up crashing and everyone loses.
Exactly. So what's the thinking behind Trump's strategy here? There's some pretty different opinions about whether this could backfire on him in a big way, maybe even cost him a lot of support. There's this phrase, I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly, which essentially means to be abandoned by everyone.
That's a pretty strong image.
Yeah, it is. So the question is, will this tough trade stance actually help him? Or will it alienate too many key players, both here in the U.S. and internationally? On the one hand, you have the argument that he could face some serious blowback. Think about it. Upset allies, pressure from U.S. businesses who are worried about their profits, maybe even a split within the Republican Party. And then you have everyday people who are going to see prices go up. Even Elon Musk, who's never been afraid to speak his mind, has reportedly criticized these tariffs. And history's full of examples of trade wars that didn't end well for anyone.
Those are some pretty compelling points. If you alienate your allies, it weakens your position on the world stage. And if people start feeling the economic pain at home, that could definitely erode his support. The business community can also be a powerful force when they're united against something.
Right, but then you had the counter-argument. Trump's always been known for his, hard-nosed negotiating style, and he's pulled off some surprising wins in the past. Plus, some people argue that he has a really loyal base of support this time around, and there's a chance that China, with her own economic pressures mounting, might eventually have to give in.
That's the other side of the coin. That perspective really emphasizes Trump's consistent stance on trade and his belief in using leverage to get what he wants. And if his core supporters stay loyal, that could give him more political room to keep pushing these policies.
So how could this all play out? Well, there are a few scenarios that people are talking about. One is that Trump might try to strike deals with some countries, like Japan and South Korea, to kind of ease the tension in the markets and maybe put more pressure on China by isolating them further.
That's a strategic move. Those kinds of targeted agreements could show that he's willing to be flexible while still keeping the pressure on China. And it could help calm down the markets a bit.
But then there's the more worrisome possibility, which is that this whole thing escalates into a full-blown crisis, a major stock market crash, inflation going through the roof, all of our allies uniting against us. That kind of scenario could put a lot of pressure on Trump to change course, even from people within his own party.
A major economic downturn or widespread condemnation from the international community, that could force anyone's hand, even someone as determined as Trump.
And it's been fascinating to see what you, our listeners, have been saying about all this. We've seen comments about how Americans sometimes seem to have this softer approach in their public statements, but then they can be very decisive in their actions. And that's contrasted with China, whose public statements are often very strong and forceful, but maybe that's masking some underlying vulnerabilities.
It's a really interesting observation about the different ways that countries communicate and how those differences might reflect their true positions and strengths.
There's also this theory floating around that Trump isn't just aiming for balanced tariffs. He wants to see a more fundamental shift towards equal trade overall. And that would mean tackling all sorts of barriers to trade, not just tariffs. But the argument is that this might be an impossible goal because of some fundamental differences in how competitive the U.S. economy is compared to other countries. And that maybe China's willingness to fight so hard comes from a fear of their economy slowly but surely declining.
That perspective suggests a much broader and potentially more difficult objective for the U.S., which could lead to a longer and more complex negotiation process. It's not just about adjusting tariffs, it's about addressing deeper economic issues.
And someone even brought up that old Teddy Roosevelt quote, "Speak softly and carry a big stick, you will go far." It definitely feels relevant to this whole situation.
That quote perfectly sums up the idea of projecting power and negotiating from a position of strength. It's definitely something to keep in mind as we see how this all unfolds.
So to wrap it all up, this latest look at Trump's tariffs shows us that the markets are still in turmoil. There's a lot of anxiety and concern from countries all over the world, and nobody really knows what's going to happen next. And your financial well-being is caught right in the middle of all this, both in the short term with those stock market swings and potentially in the long term with higher prices and a possibly slower economy. This chicken game is still very much in play, and it's anyone's guess who's going to back down first.
And the fact is, the global economy is so interconnected now that these kinds of unilateral trade actions, no matter how forcefully they're carried out, are likely to have widespread and lasting consequences for everyone involved. It's not a simple win-lose situation. The effects are much more complex than that.
That's a really important point. And on that note, here's something to really think about. With the global economy so intertwined, how long can any country, even one as powerful as the U.S., keep pursuing these aggressive go-it-alone trade policies without eventually facing some pretty serious long-term repercussions, not just for themselves, but for everyone? It might be worth looking back at history and seeing how past trade wars have played out. There are probably some valuable lessons to be learned there. And this whole story is still unfolding, so definitely keep an eye on the news and see what happens next.
Absolutely. History often rhymes, as they say. And those historical examples of trade conflicts, they can teach us a lot about the unintended consequences that can arise and how hard it is to predict what the long-term outcomes will be.
And before we wrap up, I wanted to give a shout out to our friend Micky, who we mentioned earlier with his Apple stock. He's got a really cool YouTube channel called Mickytolife, where he posts all sorts of interesting. He does travel vlogs, whiskey reviews, unboxings, all with this really chill background music. So if you're looking for something cool to check out, search for Mickytolife on YouTube. You won't be disappointed. All right, that's it for today's deep dive. We'll be back soon with more analysis on this and other big stories. Until then, stay informed and stay curious.
See you next time.